under a Tennessee reservoir where families water ski every summer, an entire Cherokee capital was drowned in 1979, and it's still waiting to answer a question the flooding was never actually meant to settle. Most people assume the Cherokee were simply the mound builders' descendants, quietly continuing on the same land their ancestors had ruled for centuries. That's not what the evidence in this valley actually shows. The agency responsible for burying that evidence, the Tennessee Valley Authority, filled this reservoir before the archaeologists it funded had even finished digging. The last man laid to rest here before the water came was Oconostota, the Cherokee war chief who spent his life defending this exact ground. 2 centuries later, his own grave was one of the final things pulled out of the earth. In the last months before the reservoir swallowed the town he died protecting. Now, in 2026, a historic drought is dragging that same reservoir's water level down, cracking open shoreline that hasn't seen daylight since the flood, and reopening a fight that has divided archaeologists for 50 years. Are the Cherokee the direct descendants of the mound-building civilization that ruled this valley first? Or are they the people who moved in after that civilization was already gone? For most of the 20th century, nobody asked the question out loud. The capital was Chota, the place where British officer Henry Timberlake walked in 1762 and mapped 52 houses and a townhouse standing beside the river, home to roughly 300 to 500 people at its peak. The state of Tennessee even takes its name from a sister town nearby, Tennessee. This was not a minor village. This was the political heart of a nation, the place where war chiefs like Oconostota negotiated with colonial governors, where councils were held, where history was made in front of witnesses who wrote it down. The prestige is not in dispute. What's in dispute is how far back that story actually goes. Because a few miles downriver, at a site called Tokwa, archaeologists digging in the 1970s hit something that didn't fit the simple version. Underneath the 18th century Cherokee houses, they found 2 platform mounds, not decorative hills. Flat-topped earthen structures, built basket load by basket load, layer by layer, over generations, each new layer added on top of the last whenever a chief's house burned or a new leader took power, by a much earlier society archaeologists call the Mississippians, farmers who grew maize on a scale large enough to support crowded river towns and built earthen mounds as platforms for their chiefs' houses and temples. This culture dominated the Tennessee Valley for centuries before European contact ever reached it. Decades earlier, in the 1930s, WPA crews excavating a similar mound town at nearby Hiwassee Island had already produced one of the first regional chronologies of this world, naming phases like Dallas and Mouse Creek that archaeologists still use to sort pottery and burials today. 2 towns, stacked in the same dirt at Toka, photographed in black and white by field crews who understood exactly what they were looking at. One Cherokee, one older. Timberlake's own 1762 map recorded 32 structures and a council house at Tokwa, a town that would later be burned by American forces in 1776, rebuilt, and burned again in 1780 and 1788. A place destroyed and reoccupied so many times that even its own 18th century story was already a patchwork before archaeologists ever got involved. And the deeper question that has haunted this valley ever since is brutally simple. Are these the same people, one culture quietly continuing on the same ground? Or is this a story of replacement, one population disappearing and another moving in to take its place? Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Cherokee is not linguistically a southeastern language at all. It belongs to the Iroquoian family, and its closest linguistic relatives, Mohawk, Seneca, Huron, sit near the Great Lakes, 1,000 miles north. For decades, this fed a straightforward theory. The Cherokee migrated south, arriving in Tennessee relatively late, possibly after the Mississippian mound builders were already gone. The ethnologist James Mooney recorded exactly this kind of oral tradition from Cherokee elders in the late 1800s, publishing it in his landmark collection of Cherokee myths and sacred formulas, stories of an ancestral journey down from the north, passed down long before any archaeologist ever put a shovel in the ground. It's a clean explanation. But not every researcher accepts it. Archaeologist Thomas White has argued the opposite, that Cherokee split off from the northern Iroquoian languages almost 4,000 years ago, and that the split itself happened right here, in the southern Appalachians. If White is right, Cherokee-speaking ancestors weren't recent arrivals chasing an empty valley. They'd been rooted in this region since long before anyone built a single mound. So even the linguists can't agree on which direction the migration ran or whether it happened at all. And that uncertainty matters because it feeds directly into a much larger, well-documented southeastern pattern. Archaeologists call it the vacant quarter, a term used to describe a genuine, well-documented collapse. Across roughly 50,000 square miles of the Mississippi, Ohio, and Tennessee River valleys, mound-building societies came apart hard in the 1400s and the 1500s, hit by drought, warfare, and the kind of unraveling that leaves whole regions empty of year-round settlement. If the Tennessee Valley emptied out the same way, then the Cherokee weren't the mound builders' heirs. They were newcomers arriving generations later to land that had already gone quiet. Carbon dating backs up part of that story. Radiocarbon samples pulled from mound sites across the wider region cluster right at the front edge of that same window, confirming that whatever caused the vacant quarter hit hard and hit early, not as a slow fade, but as a sharp break in the archaeological record. The dates are real. What they mean for this particular valley is where the agreement stops. And in 1974, a University of Tennessee skeletal study seemed to back that up. Researcher Moira Wright compared the bones from the Mississippian layer at Dallas Face sites to later Cherokee remains, and the biology didn't line up cleanly. The mound builders looked, physically, more consistent with other southeastern groups than with the historic Cherokee living on the same land later. Wright herself was careful. She called the result suggestive at best. But suggestive was enough. For years, it quietly supported the replacement theory, the idea that whoever built those mounds and whoever buried their dead at Chota were not in fact the same population. That should have settled something. It didn't. Because the deeper archaeologists looked at the 18th century Cherokee towns themselves, the stranger the pottery got. At sites like Mealiquo, along the same river, excavators found local shell-tempered pottery sitting in the same households as a completely different style. Grit-tempered pottery matching towns over 100 miles away in western North Carolina. That's not decoration, that's a fingerprint. Researchers studying a related Cherokee site downstream at Townsend reached a similar conclusion, that these communities weren't single bloodlines occupying ancestral ground. They were assembled, household by household, out of families who had migrated from different, geographically scattered Cherokee settlements and rebuilt themselves into a single town, sharing one riverbank, cooking over the same hearths, burying their dead in the same ground. So, which is it? Did the Cherokee replace an empty valley or merge into one that was never fully abandoned? For a long time, the empty valley theory held the advantage, mostly because nobody could find enough 17th century material to prove otherwise. That's exactly the century that matters most, and it's exactly the century the region's archaeological record goes strangely thin, not because people vanished, because that period, wedged between the last mound-building towns and the first colonial trade goods, is one of the hardest stretches in North American archaeology to actually see in the ground, a stretch with almost no European documentation and pottery styles that are notoriously difficult to date precisely. Then, in 2016, a University of Tennessee dissertation went looking specifically for that missing century. Researcher Jessica Dalton Carragher used something small and easy to overlook: European glass trade beads, the kind swapped in early contact era exchange, and compared them against a fresh microseriation of local ceramic styles. Beads can be sourced and dated with real precision using chemical analysis, tracing the glass back to specific manufacturing periods in Europe. When Dalton Carragher laid those results against the pottery sequence, the pattern did not show a clean break. It showed continuity, evidence of people still living in the valley, still making pottery, still trading, straight through the supposedly empty 17th century. That is a real problem for the replacement theory. If the valley was never fully vacated, then the story isn't migrants arriving into silence. It's something messier and honestly more human. Survivors of the old mound-building world, weakened by disease and disruption after European contact, absorbing incoming Cherokee-speaking households, the two groups fusing together under pressure into the towns that colonial officers like Timberlake eventually mapped and named. It means the same Riverbank held funerals for smallpox victims and weddings between families who had never met a generation earlier, all inside the span of one difficult century. Archaeologists have reconstructed the same pattern of coalescence at Cherokee town sites further east. At a site called Coweta Creek in the mountains of western North Carolina, excavators found something almost eerie. 6 separate townhouses, built one directly on top of the last, on the exact same footprint, spanning more than 100 years. Not one building maintained over time. 6 generations choosing, again and again, to rebuild in the same sacred spot, rather than start over somewhere else, absorbing newcomers into that spot, rather than simply replacing whoever came before them. Archaeologists now have a term for this. They call it coalescence. Not descent, not replacement. A merger, forced by catastrophe. That does not prove the mound builders' bloodline simply continued untouched into the historic Cherokee. It does not erase Wright's 1974 skeletal findings or the genuine linguistic distance between Cherokee and its southeastern neighbors. Nobody has ever run an ancient DNA study directly comparing Dallas Fay's mound builder remains to Overhill Cherokee remains. The one test that could settle this with real biological data. That gap still sits wide open, but the new evidence does make the simple version, one people quietly continuing unchanged for 1,000 years, or one people quietly vanishing to make room for another, much harder to defend. And this is the part almost nobody talks about. We may never get that DNA test, because the towns where this question could theoretically be answered no longer exist above ground. In the 1960s, the Tennessee Valley Authority began planning the Tellico Dam on the Little Tennessee River. The University of Tennessee got a narrow window to excavate before the reservoir went in, digging at Chota, Tanasi, Tokua, Sitico, Tomatli, and Mialaquo between 1967 and the early 1980s under real deadline pressure. The project's own stated research goals included, in plain language, questions about Cherokee origins and how long the valley had actually been inhabited. The exact question still unresolved today. Crews worked trench by trench against a clock nobody controlled, cataloging pottery sherds and burial features into field notebooks, knowing the water was coming, whether the work was finished or not. Everything we know from that stratigraphy, the mounds under the villages, the mixed pottery, the burials, came out of that race. In 1978, the case somehow reached the Supreme Court. The dam threatened a small fish, the snail darter, and under the Endangered Species Act, the court actually blocked construction. It looked, for a moment, like the towns might survive. Congress overrode it anyway, attaching an exemption to an appropriations bill. President Carter signed it in September 1979. Cherokee plaintiffs tried one more time. In Sequoia versus TVA, they argued in federal court that Chota was sacred ground, protected under religious freedom law, calling the valley, in their own filings, the birthplace of the Cherokee, and warning that flooding it would sever something that couldn't be replaced. The courts denied the claim. Weeks later, the reservoir filled. Chota, Tanasi, and most of Tokwa disappeared under water that has not fully receded since. TVA raised one small strip of the Chota site above the new waterline and built a memorial there, 8 stone pillars representing the 7 clans and the nation itself. Okinostota's remains were identified during the salvage dig by grave goods, including a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, and reinterred at that same spot, the last piece of the man who had spent his life defending this ground now permanently anchored above the water that took the rest of it. In 1986, 191 Cherokee ancestral remains recovered from the excavations were reburied near the Sequoia Birthplace Museum. What survived the excavation without a burial, the pottery, the beads, the mound soil samples, sits today in storage at the University of Tennessee's McClung Museum, cataloged and boxed, labeled with site numbers instead of answers. Between 2019 and 2021, the museum ran a full reassessment of everything still on display, working with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and the Museum of the Cherokee Indian to decide what belonged behind glass and what belonged back in the ground. The Eastern Band's Tribal Historic Preservation Office still leads repatriation claims tied to sites across this region today under federal NAGPRA law, decades after the water closed over the original ground. Think about who actually has a stake in which version wins. If the Cherokee are the mound builders' direct heirs, that strengthens an unbroken claim to this exact valley generations before any treaty or reservation line was drawn. If the coalescence theory holds instead, that doesn't weaken Cherokee identity, but it does complicate any narrative, academic or political, that treats Cherokee as a fixed, ancient category rather than a nation partly forged and partly chosen under the pressure of catastrophe. Neither version is a small thing to get wrong in a region where land claims, cultural affiliation, and legal recognition still depend on exactly this kind of history. For the agency that flooded the physical evidence that could settle any of this, the question is even less comfortable because reopening it means reopening the decision that put a nation's capital underwater in the first place. And for the universities and museums holding what was salvaged, every new theory is also a reason to look again at what's sitting in their own storage shelves. The dam is not up for debate anymore. The history buried beneath it still is. So the evidence base for this entire mystery is frozen. Whatever wasn't excavated before 1979 is still down there, sealed under a reservoir, untestable, unscannable, waiting on decisions made by a dam that was never supposed to survive a Supreme Court ruling in the first place. Elsewhere in the valley at Hawassi Island, a geophysical survey that using ground-penetrating equipment found intact, readable features still preserved beneath the surface. Proof that this kind of evidence doesn't have to be destroyed just because it's buried. Nobody has run that kind of survey over what's left of Chota or Tokwa. Not yet. Which brings us back to the drought. Through 2024, 2025, and into 2026, the Tennessee Valley has faced some of its driest conditions on record. TVA has reported river runoff among the lowest in over a century and a half of measurements, and officials have publicly warned that reservoir levels across the system are gradually drifting down. Reservoirs across the system, including the lake sitting over Chota and Tokwa, have been drawn down further than usual. No confirmed new discovery has come out of that drawdown yet. Nobody has announced a fresh find of Mississippian or Cherokee material along that specific shoreline. But every time the water drops another few inches, exposing another strip of cracked mud that hasn't seen daylight since 1979, stumps and old fence lines and stretches of hardened clay reappearing along the shoreline, the possibility sits there, uncomfortable and unresolved, that the lake is holding back the one piece of evidence that could finally answer the question that has outlived every archaeologist who's tried to settle it. Stand at the Chota Memorial today, and you're standing on the only sliver of the original town that was never allowed to drown. 8 stone pillars, weathered by 50 summers of lake wind, facing a reservoir that hides the mound the village, the graves, and the answer underneath all three. The story was never as clean as the Cherokee were always here, or the Cherokee arrived and the old world was already gone. The mound builders didn't simply vanish, and the Cherokee weren't simply strangers. This valley forced two peoples to become one, twice, once under the pressure of catastrophe centuries ago, and once more the moment a dam decided which parts of that story got to survive. Somewhere under that water, the ground still remembers which version is true. The lake is only getting lower. If you want more investigations like this one, subscribe. And tell me, do you think the Cherokee were the mound builders who never left this valley, or two peoples who were forced to become one? Let me know what you think the evidence actually shows.